So the theme of the course for this spring is disenfranchisement, fugitivity, and charting a path towards freedom. And as you all know, those of y'all who have been showing up in this course week after week, you all know that each week so far, we've been really working to understand this term fugitivity. Like, what exactly does it mean? And so far, it seems like our working understanding of fugitivity, it seems to include people's collective decisions and action to free themselves from oppressive systems and structures. Each week, we've also been tackling a topic related to our larger theme. Last week, we had a great discussion about immigration as a fugitive activity. Today's session will focus on shared liberation as a fugitive activity. And when we say shared liberation, we're talking about both racial and class solidarity in this effort to chart a path towards freedom. I'm excited to introduce our speakers who will share their thoughts and experiences on this subject. So first, we have Leone. Leone is the founder and executive director of Working Family Solidarity and has worked for 30 years organizing workers and working families of all backgrounds for economic and racial justice. Next, we have Chris. Chris is an award-winning designer and community organizer and is the founder of ChiByDesign, a Black-owned and people of color-led social and civic design firm. Chris has a deep background in social equity work, systems change, and youth development. He's worked with youth and community residents across Chicago, supporting them in designing new anti-racist infrastructure to enable an equitable future. Chris is also a former clinical professor of practice and lead of community-led design at the Institute of Design at IIT, where his work focused on advancing the co-design practice and developing an anti-racist design field. Chris is a former Stanford Institute of Design Civic Innovation Fellow, a 2021 Illinois Science and Technology Coalition Researcher to know, and a 2022 World Changing Ideas honoree. Next, we've got Caesar, who will be our moderator for this discussion today. Caesar is a community health worker, oral historian, student, educator, and action researcher at the University of Illinois Chicago, focused on healthy work, liberatory pedagogy, and the subjective well-being of Black folks. They organized to protect Chicago communities from COVID-19, to support newly arrived and undocumented residents, and for collective liberation as part of radical public health at UIC in collaboration with the Progressive Student Coalition and as part of Healthcare Workers for Palestine, Chicago. So we're going to have a discussion today, kind of like last week. And I want to encourage you all to drop your comments and reflections in the chat as we listen to our speakers discuss these concepts of racial unity and class solidarity and this path towards freedom. Once our moderator has asked some of our first starter questions, I want to invite everyone in the class to continue putting questions and comments in the chat, but also please come off mute and say your questions out loud and be in conversation with our panelists and our speakers for today. We'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion with all of us about what we've heard. So without further ado, Chris, Leone, Caesar, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that incredible introduction. And again, welcome everyone to another great session. I hope you all will enjoy it. And I'm not going to waste too much time. We'll get right into it. I'm just going to start with you, Chris, just because you were on top when I had my little list of windows. And I would love for you to give us a little context as to like your space in the community here in Chicago and like what makes you want to be here tonight talking about strategies and fugitivity and shared liberation.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here with you all. Super excited to be in this conversation. Leon is a good friend and someone who I know brings a lot to this conversation. Not just the conversation, but the work. Um, so my work professionally is really around design and how do we use this this field of design to create anti-racist futures? How do we build new infrastructures to enable an anti-racist future to happen? Which typically design is not about that. Design in its truest form is really about how do you help capitalism make a lot of money, and then therefore create racist outcomes. That has been a huge part of the design field. I know from urban planning to architecture to graphic design, you can find lots of things that promote a very racist aesthetic, a very racist outlook on the world, on people. And so my work professionally is all about how do we enable folks to come together and create uh, new possibilities through this field of design. But who I really am is just someone who cares deeply about uh, changing the world. I grew up in Chicago, and so part of this relates to the design story. I tell people that anti-racist design as a field had to come from Chicago because we understand racism better than anybody else on the planet because we live in the most racist city, I would argue, on the planet, right? This is
Mm,
the home of segregation, the creator, the designer of racial housing segregation. And so it gives us a unique understanding of how this works. It gives us a unique experience to how it's all happened. Um, and so growing up here, and my parents were very staunch anti-racist. I grew up in a household where going to fight the Klan was just kind of something you did. That wasn't like a special thing. It was just like, for some folks, when I hear them say like, oh, my parents, you just voted. That's what you were going to do, or you were going to go to college. In my house, you were going to fight racism. That was the expectation. And so, happy to be here and talk more about those things and, um, yeah, see how we can all work together to do more of that.
all right, appreciate you. That was dope. Leone, can you do me a favor and answer that same question? Give me a little more context on like where you're coming from so people know um where this like source of all this wisdom that y'all gonna be sharing with us is coming from.
Thanks a lot, Caesar. Yeah, let's hope there's a lot of wisdom, or even some wisdom. But yeah, so my name is Leone Jose Bicchieri. The name is half Italian, half Mexican. My dad's came to the United States from Italy when he was about 30. He grew up in Mussolini's Hitler. He fought against the Nazis as a in the underground Italian. Um, so kind of like Chris, I think a lot of who I became was from my parents. My mom's from Mexico. She's from Mexico City. May they both rest in peace. She was an activist. Her father was part of Lázaro Cárdenas's um, anti-gringo. They nationalized Mexico's oil back. You're talking about 34, 35, 36. My grandfather, my mom's father, was killed during that time in a political assassination. So I grew up in a household. My parents divorced when I was 4. My mom remarried an African American man from Cincinnati who grew up after about the age of 9 in Galesburg because his mom, Dorothy, got a job at the Maytag. Is it a Frigidaire or Maytag? But there was like an industrial facility there that made Frigidaires and stuff like refrigerators. And one of the reasons she had family there, but she went because it was a union job. You're talking 50s. Tremendous racism in the unions. There's still a lot, right? But at that time, it was very difficult, and yet it was something of a class-based struggle, right? So her job compared to others was at least okay, and she married a letter carrier, National Association of Letter Carriers. So an African American man named John Lovis, and they had a little house on Mulberry Street in Galesburg where we used to go every Thanksgiving. And so I think a lot of those forces, made me think a lot. So when we would come home from school, we say, yeah, man, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, man, these guys, man, they're great. And one of them chopped down a cherry tree. But other than that, they're amazing, right? And my stepfather, Gary, would be like, uh-huh. And now they did tell you these were all slave owners, right? And I was like, well, they kind of left that part out. And I was like, okay. And did they tell you that in those first elections, not only did you have to be white to vote, you had to be a white male, and you had to have a certain amount of property. Poor whites couldn't vote either, right? And so that class and race thing started in me early, and I don't pretend to have mastered it, and I don't pretend to be an expert. What I pretend is that it means a lot to me, and I'm willing to go on this journey with other people who have figured out that capitalism has perfected racism. And it is, in my opinion, the most important tool that capitalism has to make sure that poor workers, who are the obvious majority in the world, right? So we should quickly have this thing under control. But many times, and in my personal experience, I've been in the farm worker movement. I founded Working Family Solidarity about 8 years ago. Our mission is to unite low income workers of different backgrounds, races, and ethnicities, but particularly all are welcome, but particularly, especially in Chicago, on the west, southwest, south sides, African American and Latinx families. Because strategically, there's a lot of us in this country, there's a lot of us in Chicago, but we are told that we're not supposed to get together and that we're the cause of each other's problems, right? And nothing could be further from the truth. And so our organization, Working Family Solidarity, brings together folks from different backgrounds to fight. And we'll say more, but I'll leave it at this for this part of the introduction. When you look at why Chicago's an immigrant sanctuary city, a lot of people are like, wow, those Latinos must have got together and passed something in City Hall. Well, it was a black man named Harold Washington that pushed the first idea of sanctuary city, right? Not because he's like, well, I want to help those people, but I never met Harold. My belief, I would like to think, from everything I've heard about him, he was an amazing man. I think he probably understood that if we don't do this together, no one's going to do it. And again, so how fitting was it that it was an African American who helped get Sanctuary City for Immigrants started? And that's where we're trying to come from in our organization, is figure out how we've been pitted, not by just discussion, but by working together on specific campaigns for justice at workplaces and beyond. So that's why I'm here, and I'm really happy. And again, I've told people that even if I didn't like the topic, which I love, I would have come on just because I knew Chris was going to be the other person.
We're really so glad to have both of y'all, especially to hear together. And thank you for that introduction and that context, which I think is really important when you're approaching this kind of work, to make sure people know where you're coming from so they can appreciate it and maybe try to find a little bit of themselves in there, to find some way to relate so that we're not just talking around each other, you know. So we're going to start with one of our kind of pre-generated questions, but I want everybody to start thinking about questions, start putting them in the chat whenever you have time. And I'm just going to start, and either one of y'all can kind of take this and run with it. So we're talking about acts of shared liberation tonight, especially acts that are being criminalized, whether it's protest or masking, which I want to talk about in week 15 coming up down the line. And so, like, what strategies can people and communities use to resist these efforts to criminalize our efforts to be united and to work together for our own benefit?
You'll probably have to call on one of us, Caesar, because Chris and I are going to defer to each other till
I
kingdom
see him
comes. So you
thinking.
probably,
I see him thinking. I see the wheels turning, and I know the engine is like revving up. So I know you might have to jump in if you want.
I don't mind starting. So I mean, yeah, it feels like I feel like if I had the perfect answer, then we'd be a lot farther along in this fight. But some of the things that I've been trying to be a part of, I was in the farm worker movement on the West Coast for some time. I came back to the Chicago area. I did not grow up here. I grew up in southern Wisconsin, Beloit, Madison, Milwaukee. Um, and I've been here since 2000. My first 8 years, I did a lot of work. I traveled all the time. So I spent a lot of time in Arkansas, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, and then in Kansas, Missouri, Iowa. And then 2008, I wanted to stay more in Chicago and I started working here in the worker center movement. But um, so I think, and I say that because those are the kinds of things, Caesar, that I have felt are effective is labor organizing. And I think that one of the things we often do is when people say labor movement, we think of the big unions. And that's a mistake because, first of all, if there are big unions, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But we are the labor movement. Like poor people of color, we're the labor movement. No one else is the labor movement. We're the labor movement. Capital L. Everyone else is small l. But because of the way we're educated and we're brought up, we're not taught about class. People don't even know what class is, right? It's just you better get there on time to your class. But in school, we're taught essentially that Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, some of the basic things in life, pensions, and so on, that God just bestowed those on the United States because we're so wonderful. Or the National Labor Relations Act was created in 1935 because Congress was really elated. It was created because in the 20s and 30s, there were so many strikes in this country. We're not, Chris knows all this, but we're not taught about this, right? And so there were so many strikes, people in Detroit taking over the Rouge plant, right? The giant auto factory. And at that time, it was not considered radical to talk about communism and socialism and workers owning stuff. It was considered, now this is going to be a struggle now to see which train of thought really wins in this world, right? And so the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 was not created because Roosevelt and Congress woke up one day and said, everyone has to have more rights. They woke up and said, we got to head this off at the pass. These workers are going to take over and we better give them something. And so you had strikes that 2,000 workers would take over the Rouge plant in Detroit, but their demand was not higher wages. They wanted to own the company. They wanted to own that factory. And they asked why they shouldn't, because they're the ones who are the means of production. So why should someone else own your means of production? And so the National Labor Relations Act came into account in 1935 to give people the right to have a union, but it took away secondary boycotts. It took away a lot of rights. So, Caesar, for me, the labor struggle on, not that unions aren't part of it, but I think the more that as we come up in the neighborhoods, in the barrios, and we learn what it means to be in class solidarity with other people, we can break down some of those barriers that make us think skin color has really any relevance at all in anything, right? And understand how, in my opinion, from personal farm workers, uh, you know, poultry workers, meat packers, janitors, you name the particular group of workers. Every time I've been a part of a struggle that has gotten through a few of the obstacles, gotten start to get close to winning, every single time the race card was used. Every single time. It would be like, hey man, we're about to lose, the bosses, and they start going, go to the different races and figure out anything you can to get them to not work together. Somali, Vietnamese, black, white, because once we see that those are differences that other people have told us we should accept, but they don't come from us. We're not born with it. And the more we accept that working class people simply don't have the same interests as the owner class, then we can really advance. So, Caesar, what we're trying to do, and I'll end with this, is we're trying to do what I'm talking about in concrete campaigns. We have a local hire, targeted hire campaign, and various other things we're working on where we bring folks together to figure out what it's like to struggle together so that people of different races have an experience that's positive, that comes from supporting folks workers from another race, because we need to multiply the positive experiences that we have. For example, when Latinx people work with Black people, workers, and we do good things, we need to have more of those experiences, and then we build up and we kind of change our mentality about folks who other folks tell us we really shouldn't get along with.
Oh, thank you. That was fantastic. And here at E of I, we love a good history lesson, especially when it's the history that they don't want us to know. And another little piece of context before I pass it right to you, Chris, is completely incidentally, I happened to be at two separate events this weekend. One was at Work and Family Solidarity with Leone. One was with Chris. And both events, since we're on this topic of strategies, there were Black folks, there were white folks, there were Latinx folks, and we had translation at both of those events, there were we used either technology or we used a person to just repeat the words to make sure that everyone in that room was included in these conversations. And that, to me, that's praxis. That's you putting your principles into practice and doing the work to make sure that everyone is included and we are not we are that's shared liberation to me. That's the work. And so Chris, if you can give us your answer to that question about criminalization of acts of shared liberation and strategies that people and communities can use.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate what Leone said around, at the root of it all is like it's one class versus the other. It's the working class versus the ruling class. And the ruling class is really united, regardless of race. We can see they will go to all their galas together. They will share stock tips. They will, as long as they're going to exploit us, they don't really care. And so we have to have that mindset of class solidarity, right? That it's regardless of your color, regardless of what country you come from, your parents came from, what food you eat, right? We have a shared interest in defeating the people who are trying to hurt us, right? This criminalization, the people who are criminalizing us, who criminalize our behavior, our existence. That is a group of people, right? Who transcend racial barriers and identity barriers and all the things that they feed us with to try to keep us from fighting. So I think one thing, one is like we really have to understand that like race is just BS, right? This is a public health, this is a science course. It's not real. Like, we have to really understand that it is not real, and all these things that they try to pitch to us uh, to convince us that it is just BS, right? I think the another strategy, because you made me think about this from the weekend. I think people have to get comfortable with breaking the law. That if they're not if the fact that they criminalize our ability or our efforts to try to be liberated or safe, right? Sometimes it's not. We're not even fighting for liberation. We're fighting for just sheer safety in our neighborhood, in our school, uh, and that then is illegal. And so we are going to have we're going to have to be get more comfortable with breaking the law as a strategy that, these things don't go away, these laws don't go away unless they're broken, unless they're fought against. And so, you think about slavery, it didn't go away. That was the law of the land. Enslaving human beings was what you were supposed to do. And it wasn't until there was a very violent, many violent instances of breaking that law were we able to do away with it. So, I think that's something that folks are going to have to get familiar with and get comfortable with. It's not. I think me and Leone have both been arrested before. It ain't a party, but it ain't the worst thing either. So I'll put it that way.
Caesar, can I say something?
Please.
Just really quick, building up, because Chris was talking about the law. Obviously we're facing. I mean, this is not new, right? So, but it's a heightened level of anti-immigrant. Round them up and throw them out kind of thing. But it's happened before in our history, right? Multiple times. So it's not new. But one of the things now in the Know Your Rights, it's very interesting because there are organizations doing the Know Your Rights on ICE and immigration, and they're careful to make sure they have immigration lawyers, Chris, and they say things like, if they have an administrative warrant, you don't have to, open the door. Or if they have this warrant, you don't have to open the door. But if they have a judicial warrant signed by a judge, the law says, you have to do this and this. And it's very interesting because our Know Your Rights is you don't have to do a damn thing that you don't want to do. In other words, we'll tell you what the law is so you understand your choices and the consequences of your choices if you don't open that door, even if ICE has a judicial warrant. So we never tell people, because ICE has this or that, you have to comply. We never say that. What we tell them is, these are the consequences that could happen if that person is in your house and you don't open the door for ICE. They might go to the back door, they might surveil your house, they might try to get you at work. These are the choices you make. But it's not my place to tell that person that if they show you a judicial warrant, you should let them in, because that's what the law says. Because when they get in, they see your grandma who was born in Guerrero, and they start to talk to her. And she says, "Oh, yeah, I was born in Guerrero." And they say, "Oh, you were born outside the US? Come with me." Because now I got a legal right to follow up with you. The majority of people rounded up by ICE are not targets. They're collateral damage. So ICE is just trying to get in your house or talk to you on the street and then get you. So I really appreciate what Chris is saying. What we tell people, and if you're documented, same thing, you have to make a personal decision on what you're ready to do to fight this bullshit. ICE, police, anything, right? Just like Chris said, break the law, don't break the law. That's your choice. We respect your choice. We just want you to know the different consequences so you can make the choice. But we won't win this war just on the legal front.
I would say, I mean, I think we definitely won't win it on the legal front, like, because they make the law, right? Like, the enemy is making the law and then changes the law and does whatever those judges work for. I mean, this brings up a whole bigger discussion about the state. But I think, yes, to your point around it is an individual decision on whether we're going to break the law or not. I think what I'm putting forward is that we have to have organizations that are committed to doing that regardless, and that it's not just you as Jessica or um Emily, or I'm reading Joel, I'm just reading names I see on the screen, that it's not just about you getting arrested, because just one person getting arrested is not going to change this thing. So the question you asked, Caesar, about strategies, like, we have to have organizations that is part of the strategy. So you made me think about that, because I was in Ferguson in 2014. And after they acquitted, well, they didn't acquit. They didn't even indict Darren Wilson. They decided not to even charge him with the murder of Mike Brown. And the working class rebelled in August right after they killed him, and they rebelled for many, many days. Um, and when they had the non-indictment, the working class rebelled again. And so what the state did at that time was they made protest illegal. You could not protest in the street. And so an organization I'm in, we went down there and we broke that. We said you were not going to tell the working class of Ferguson when and where they can protest. And so we got arrested. A bunch of us got arrested. They attacked us really violently. But it was the principle of the organization that was what we have to do. That I think, we're talking about fascism a lot more. Legality is out the window when we're talking about fascism. So that we're gonna like somehow outmaneuver them and during a fascist period is not true, right? So we're gonna have to get much more comfortable with a lot more aggressive strategies and tactics if we are going to have collective liberation.
Okay, so on that tip, I'm gonna pull us into one of our questions from the chat now. I'm gonna try to get to everybody's questions, but this is very relevant to what you were just saying, Chris. So I'm gonna jump ahead to this recent one. And also, I was thinking about what you said, and it reminded me of the free speech zones, which was the other tactic they were using, telling people you can't protest here or there. Told the media you got to stand in that Walgreens parking lot or Walmart parking lot, a mile away from where the action's happening. They tried everything. But this question is, how do you help navigate fruitful conversations and organizing with people who struggle to understand the value of a diversity of tactics? And they say, I'm thinking about my work as a homeless service provider and banging my head against the wall, doing advocacy with people who think the only valuable work is lobbying or appealing to politicians.
No, I'll say something, and again, I don't answer like, well, I have the answer, but I'll share some things that we try to do at Working Family Solidarity. I think one of the thing is, um, there's there's advocacy work, which is important, and then there's organizing. And if you're organizing people, low income workers, so that's our base in 8 neighborhoods on the west, southwest, and south side of Chicago. They're all either Latinx majority or African American majority neighborhoods. So one of the things is, um, you know, it's positive to ask someone, for their support. But what's also good is to organize people who are desperately just trying to survive. In other words, we're not saying, please support this other person. We're saying, you want to stay in that apartment another month? Let's go. You want to earn more than $10 an hour. I don't care what the minimum wage is, because that's what a lot of people get paid, cash in the hand in Chicago. We're going to have to win it, kind of like Chris is saying, because no one's coming to help. This is it. You want to know what we got? Look around you. That's what we got. It's pretty much you and other workers, but we're not used to seeing ourselves as powerful, right? I know a lot of nonprofit organizations that supposedly work on for the benefit of low income workers of color, but they're condescending, right? It's like, well, we have these really smart white lawyers that have all these great tactics we can use. My response: we don't need them. We got all we need here. When we started working Family Solidarity, we made sure that, and it's been this way for the last 8 years, the boards always had African American or Latinx members. Our staff has always been Latinx and African American and so on. And we're not shunning other races, because we also don't want to upset that. So, over time, who knows what'll happen. But one of the reasons we wanted to do that was to show our own people that we have brains, kind of like Chris was saying, race is a social construct, right? And the whole notion that people of color, like, we have different brains. We got the same brains everyone else has, same CC, cubic centimeters, and they work just as fine. And we know what to do, but we have not been in a position where we believe, and we haven't had the class consciousness to believe that our superior numbers can translate into victory. And so I think one of the things it takes sometimes are smaller victories. Folks about to get evicted come together and we slow that eviction. Maybe we stop it. Maybe we give that family 3, 4 more months, and then people start to say, hey, okay, you know what? We came together. It wasn't a very fancy strategy, but we did something. And I think I'm thinking of the advocacy. Sometimes we're asking people to support us, and sometimes I think the direct organizing is, how much are you willing to do just to support yourself, right? What kind of leadership are you willing to take as a janitor, as a worker at a Tyson plant, as a house cleaner, right? As a laundry cleaner, or whatever, to change your situation. I think that's one of the things we're trying to do at Working Family Solidarity, is multiply those smaller victories so people start to feel more powerful, so they can take on other people.
I appreciate that. That makes me think of when we talk about mutual aid and we talk about helping each other and how sometimes it can not result in agency being felt or increased by people who are suffering through a lot or being oppressed. And so giving people that ability that and helping them recognize how much power they have and how much they can be a factor in their own lives, no matter how big the system seems, I feel like is really important as a tactic. And Chris, do you want to speak to diversity of tactics, or do you want me to hit you with another question?
I very, very quickly. I mean, I feel like I can relate to this question because every 4 years we got an election, and I have this exact conversation. Well, I guess every time there is an election, so every 2 years. But like, I don't vote, and so my friends who do vote are like, "You gotta do this. This is like the way we do it," and I'm like, "No, I do it this way." And that's more direct organizing, more direct action, like Leone's talking about. And they're like, well, that doesn't do anything, right? You just be marching through the street and nothing changes. um and so I think, one thing that's been helpful for me is I still have not voted, but I will participate in things that they do. If they're going to have a lunch or something and people are going to talk about candidates, right? Like, going to their things and then having them come to my things, and I'm putting those in quotes, right? Um, so that they can experience different things, right? And like, I think it's ultimately about a relationship, whether or not you're going to move somebody to expand their horizon on anything, whether that's like, do I like barbecue ribs, or do I think diversity of tactics of organizing are important. And so I think the second part, and here is like, you also have to decide, is this person worth you trying to convince? Like, and if they're not, don't worry about the conversation. So, but if they are, then it's a long-term outlook you have to have with people, that they will move to a different position. And if they're not, and worth it in your opinion, don't waste your time. Took me a long time to realize that.
Look, it does. It's I had to kind of come across some kind of similar moments in my COVID organizing around like, sometimes it's worth it to have that deep conversation with somebody, but also sometimes you got to recognize when it's counterproductive. And similarly, we talked last week about um the chapter in Let This Radicalize You very briefly called Organizing Isn't Matchmaking, where basically, like, you don't necessarily have to be friends with the people you organize with. You don't necessarily have to have the exact same perspective or beliefs, but you do need to share some principles and you do need to be able to, to work together. And if you can't, then you probably shouldn't. Like if it's really not working, don't, put a square peg in a round hole, right? That was a good conversation about diversity of tech. I really appreciate that. And I'm gonna move us up to the first question we got in the chat, which actually I remember hearing you speak about this, Leone, at the reparations march we had during the DNC week last year. So this question is generally about the idea of like a black versus brown war started between um, brown folks supposedly taking jobs, they're making more money than black folks, and the whole idea of this kind of crabs in a barrel, this sort of divide and conquer tactic of separating black and brown folks. Like, when did that start? Is like what the question is, and maybe you can give us just a little context.
I mean, first of all, it's a great question. I am not sure I know historically if there was a starting point, so I remain open to learning more about that. I mean, you know what, but I think it's a great question, a great comment, because I mean, think about it, right? For all the black folks, listening right now as a Latino, how many times have we literally killed each other? We've killed each other, right? Because we're so convinced that that's a good outcome. That's really going to change. My family's better off, right? Because I did something nasty to black people, and so it's really important, I think. And I don't think we have time to maybe do all of that, but we should all think about who told us that, because it wasn't us. And as Chris was talking about, it's the owner class. Because once people figure out that black, brown, and any other color has really nothing to do with you getting up in the morning and selling your labor to just try to survive that day, mental, emotional, intellectual labor, right? Then the gig is up. It's what keeps the owner class intact. Is in India, if everyone's brown skinned, then you got to say, well, gee, let's make sure Muslims and Hindus don't get along. In Northern Ireland, look how smart Great Britain was. They're all white. Oh no, what are we going to do? They're all white. They're going to be united. No, no, we're going to have promote something called the Orange Men of the Protestants. They're better than the Catholics. How dumb is that, right? When you read it, you kind of laugh, but it worked. A lot of people died, right? Because of that. So it's whatever works at the time, and black versus brown is extremely important for the owner class, because look in Chicago. I mean, because of the plan, and it's not accidental, it's a plan to move black people out of Chicago. What is it, 200,000 at least have moved out of Chicago in the last 10 years? And that's primarily been done by the destruction of public housing, right? Abla Homes, Harold Dickey, Greenie Green, Robert Taylor Homes, so on and so forth. With Mexican people, it's mainly been done just by the property tax raising, because we live in all these little 10, 12 people in different parts of a house or whatever. So then we're just moving further out. But the plan is to get rid of both of us. So I'm not sure where that came from, or the very first start of it. Certainly, the notion coming from more powerful people that as Mexican immigrants flooded into the United States, let's just keep it within the last few decades, that black people have lost jobs. And that goes back to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And so when that started some years ago, it ended up not being a good thing for Mexico or the United States. I mean, great for the owner class in both countries. They made out like bandits, bad for everyone else. And one time someone said, man, Leon, I guess NAFTA just didn't work. And I was like, what do you mean? It worked perfectly. It was never designed to help the working class. Nothing ever is. It was designed to move capital south to Mexico and displace more Mexican people north to flood the labor market in the United States so that Mexican people, Black people, everyone else, where there was just more of us looking for work. And that makes it easier to exploit all of us, whether you're documented or undocumented. So it's a really good question the person had. I could go on literally for hours because that point is the most passionate thing in my life, partly for personal reasons, partly because I think it really is the key to unlocking a lot of the kind of shenanigans that the owner class has us thinking. And what I tell other, Latinx folks who will listen, some don't, but don't wait. Like, don't be like, well, if they help us, we'll help them. Don't, there is no waiting. You just work. You work on behalf of all workers. And when it includes Black people, you work on that too, right? Don't wait for someone to support you. You support other workers. And once people see, I'll stop with this thing, but here's what we've seen in Chicago in the last like 20 years. So there was a time when I was out at the Home Depot on 47th and Ashland and a whole bunch of other places with other organizations where I was the executive director at the time. And we were talking to Mexican people, and we were at 55th and Kedzie at the elite staffing in that little mall, okay, at 4 in the morning, talking to Mexican people. I'm talking to my own folks saying, there's been Black people here an hour before you got here. Okay. They're trying to get in those vans, but they're not letting the vans, right? The supervisor is going to let Mexican undocumented people in the van. And we're pleading with people to say they should go down the list and it should be by seniority. First come, first served. Who signed in first? Let them go work. And so um, there was so much tension there between the Black and Latino workers that there was almost physical violence in the parking lot, right? And then some of the Black folks started to see that several of us Latinos were like not even being supported by other Latinos, right? They were like, F you, you're a goddamn traitor. You should help your own people. And I'm like, who are my people? Who are my people? My people are workers. My people are workers, not Latinos. That's second. That's my culture. But my socioeconomic and political stature in capitalism is worker. I accept it and I'm going to fight like a worker. Because, like Chris said, you're a worker or you're an owner. If you think you're something else, you better think about that. And so we actually made some headway there. And I'll leave some of the history out because that could take a while. But I think those are the little things. We fail. I'm not saying we always won. We failed sometime. But some of the time, there would be some solidarity built between some of the Black and Latino workers. And that's how you start to chip away at this BS.
Okay. I
Appreciate that. Please
give
go ahead, Chris.
a little Chicago history. I don't know about the first, incident between Black and Mexican workers, but it's always around labor. The tension between groups within the working class is always around labor. And so when Black folks started to come up during the Great Migration, lots of tension with white workers because now you had a new set of workers to compete for jobs, right? Or that's how the bosses put it. And that way they can drive wages down. So, then you got all the race riots of the early 1900s. If anyone, people from Chicago, the southeast side of Chicago is almost 99% Mexican. That was by choice, not by the Mexican workers' choice, by the steel bosses' choice. So early 1900s, there was a steel strike in, U.S. Steel. Those are the big plants over there. And the bosses decided to break the strike by literally sending trains to Mexico, filling them up with Mexican workers and shipping them to the southeast side of Chicago. And that is why that neighborhood looks that way. So, all these, they call Chicago the city of neighborhoods. It's all based on racism and segregation, which then creates tension, which then has us fighting each other when we shouldn't. Yes, a good question. And that's, just a little Chicago history around how these tensions were fomented here. Right? These are not natural tensions. There's nothing in our blood that makes Black workers hate Mexican workers and vice versa. It is always something that is created. But I think the flip is, and I think to this conversation is about the times in which Black and Mexican and other workers have come together to fight, which that's the history they really don't want to teach us. Um, and so, I think about especially, you think about Latin folks as like indigenous to the Americas and how they helped enslaved Africans time and time again, right? The Underground Railroad, they always teach us they went north, but they also went south. They were also, black folks were captured in Mexico and fought for their freedom there as well, and they fought together. And a lot of these cultural things that we now identify as, a Latin culture is a mix of African black culture and Spanish and all these other things. And so, I think we really have to be looking to these historical examples for inspiration about how we come together versus how they've, managed to keep us apart. It's good to know how they've done it, but I think we should think about those things. And I would say the last piece is there's this group during the Civil War called San Patriciones. It was a unit. Well, they were Irish immigrants who were forced to fight in the Confederate military for slavery, and they didn't want to. They weren't for slavery. They were forced to. They were beaten like slaves, and so a group of them abandoned the U.S. military and went down to Mexico to help fight with the Mexican army against the US trying to take over the country. And so there's towns in Mexico named after some of these soldiers. And so, I just wanted to highlight multiracial unity across our history, that we have always found ways to unite with each other, to fight against our common enemy. And, I think that's the history we should really uplift as much as we can.
Well, that's so important. You just put me on to something new. I don't think I even knew anything about that. I really appreciate that. It's got me thinking about the folks who are from, I believe it's Irish folks who, some of which serve in Lebanon, actually helping protect people there. And we were this weekend, we were talking about Black folks in the Spanish Civil War fighting fascism, and like the solidarity is there. And maybe you're right, maybe that's the lens we need to be focused on, not like when these divisions started, but definitely how they made it work, and then the times in which we fought back so we can replicate that. Because that's what we really need. My dad was a steel worker, right? He worked with Filipino and Mexican and white. Part of my childhood was in Northwest Indiana, and like my neighborhood was so diverse when I was young. And then things changed. NAFTA, you know what I'm talking about? Things changed. White folks had more opportunities. They moved, and now people look at cities like Gary as like it's a failed state or something. As like my neighborhood. People from Jewish folks from Wilmette used to live in my neighborhood. They're in their 70s and 80s. They used to live in my neighborhood, which is 99% black now on the southeast side. Like the history of how these things happen is really important, and I'm glad we're getting into that. I appreciate you in it. Alicia, if you can remember your comment and you want to share, can you keep it a little concise and give us your wisdom? See if I can ping you. There you go.
Hello. Oh, hello everyone. The comment that I had want to make was is that when I was young, growing up, I've always been around Latin folks. They were my babysitter. They did my hair. I was eating their food. That's why I love Mexican or Hispanic food a lot. Not just Mexican, but also Puerto Rican food and all the different type of Hispanic culture food. And then when I got into college, my freshman year, that's when I had a culture shock. Like, the brown folks don't like you. I'm like, huh? And so I wonder, when did it actually start? Because when I was coming up, I didn't see it until I got into my adulthood, into college. That's when I started the attention. So I was kind of confused why I didn't see it as a kid, but I guess because I was out around folk, brown folk. And so I guess like you said, the solidarity, she was there, but when I got into college, it was not. And so I was just curious when that started.
Yeah, I think we got some great context from both of our guests tonight on different points in time in which those divisions were sparked up and times when they were pushed back against. And I'm going to move us into our next
Can I add one
question.
can I add one
Oh,
thing there, Caesar?
please.
Just to answer or say something to the
Hmm.
sisters. I appreciate the comment. I wonder, and it's a huge topic, deserves a lot. We've really formed our whole organization around that topic, Alicia. But one of the things that I think might have happened to you and many of us is we got into the workforce. And kind of like Chris was alluding to, once you get into the workforce, um, any notion of solidarity and unity has to be extinguished, right? So when we're kids, they kind of leave us a little alone because we're not the productive forces, right? Kind of like, oh, y'all all want to play together, black, Latino, Chinese, and that's really cool. And that, everyone's enjoying it. Once you start to get to be in your 16, 18, 20, now you're going out there and they want to make sure we compete for jobs. We can't look at each other like together, we're going to make sure there's enough good jobs for all of us. It has to be no Leone. You want that job? You better fight against a black person for that job, and so on. So I think part of it is that once we get into the workforce, things take a little bit of a different turn, and then we need to compete against each other, or at least that's what we believe, or we're made to believe.
It's too real. That is too real. So speaking of the workforce, I'm gonna move us into our next question, which is for Chris and Leonie, in your personal experiences, in what ways have you seen the so-called leadership of the labor movement try to put the brakes on workers actually uniting and advancing beyond capitalism? And how have you both chosen to respond to these attempts? And I'll leave it to you all to decide who's going to start.
I can be quick.
I was just gonna say, go on, Chris.
I ain't had many union jobs to be honest. That the economy I grew up in, that was not union jobs were real hard to get into. And so they had a bunch of low wage work for us. But it made me think about, again, thinking about times of solidarity. Um, I think statute of limitations are up on this one. I think it was like 2004. The Klan and the Nazis were marching in Berwyn, a suburb
Different.
just west of Chicago. And I was working at the airport at the time. So I actually wasn't union. Union was trash. Um 399 operating engineers, very corrupt. Another story. But so again, the organization I'm in, we went out there to confront them, to fight them. And we were successful. And a picture of me got taken, being successful, and put into like the Sun Times. And when I came back to work the next day, I worked at Terminal 5. The entire airport just started clapping. Because by the time I had gotten there for my shift, people had seen the paper and, passed the image around. And just, workers of all different races were just like, we are so proud of you. We didn't know you did this. Like, good job. So I not necessarily I don't have a direct story about like how the bosses or the unions push racial division. I'm sure I know it has happened, but that was a story about how, even though we were all there, we were all in the union, people were just very happy to see someone fighting against racism in a very direct way.
Yeah, I'll share. I mean, this is a little bit story of my life in a way. Kind of being on a little bit working with unions, but a little bit pushing unions. And Um, so I was the lead organizer for a campaign in southern Wisconsin with a very large union, and uh, we were organizing. I spent time in Madison. I spent time in Milwaukee. I was based here in Chicago, but I traveled a lot. And some of the folks, some of my higher ups, had said, "Hey, man, there was kind of a thing in Madison for a while where immigration, so because again, the bosses were starting to get tripped out because some of the workers were coming together, people who cleaned these government offices that I was organizing and others were organizing. And so we were having some success. So they were, again, now starting to look for anything, race, gender, anything, right? To divide workers because we're starting to get the largely Black and Latinx cleaners together having some success. And so, um, they were then the bosses were starting to say, well, now they're going to start to check, immigration status and so on. So um, I was invited to be on some radio show, and some of the upper folks in the union reminded me, like, hey man, you got to be careful, because they knew me and they knew I was kind of like pushing the limits all the time. So they said, be careful the way you talk about immigration stuff. We got to be a little careful here. So I said, I got it. So at one point, the person asking questions said, so Leone, at your offices down on South Park Street and up in the Hinner, what would happen if immigration came while you guys were having a meeting, or if they came to try to get your computers and all that? And I said, I'll light the office on fire. They won't get a damn thing. And, no one's getting any info on any workers that ever come here. I said, I'll blow it up before they take this. And I said, y'all, and I said, in case you're listening, this was still INS, and I said, y'all can, you can come get me. And here's who I am. This is where you can find me. This is where I live. I'm not hiding. Like, come get me. But be ready. And so, the upper folks in the union didn't like it, but kind of like Chris was saying, man, the workers loved it, man. They thought it was great, man. They were like, man, that's what I'm talking about. And they knew me. They're like, I'm not playing. I'm not reading off a script. It's like, we're gonna do this, right? And so I think those are things. I was also in that same particular large union at some of the meetings back here in Chicago, 100 staff people from all over the region, and the higher ups would say, okay, here's what's up. And also when they would talk about some racial issues, sometimes the talk would kind of be like um, pronouncing that we're all united. So it'd be like, here there's no color, there's no race, we're all workers. And they would say, does anyone want to comment? No person with brains stood up, but I did. And some of the guys near me were literally like just going like, Leone, man, don't say no, man. Just sit down, man, because you ain't gonna be here anymore. And I said, that's what we should have, but that's not what we have right now. And because we're not dealing with race here at a so-called class-based organization, all the blacks and Latinx people in this room, we will now leave and go look for that support from other organizations, because we're not going to get it here as workers of color. And so the union leadership was not overly pleased with me, to put it very mildly. So those were a couple of examples.
Yeah, that I don't know what it is about once people start getting a little bit of power, what it is that sucks people into this machine. We talk about the machine here in Chicago, right? How it changes people, and I feel like it's something I'm still trying to unpack. But I'm going to bring us into a question that's a little closer to home for our public health folks. This one is about sustaining class solidarity, and we want to talk about how my barriers to receiving essential resources, so this could be like healthcare or maybe housing, um, influence the strength of our class solidarity movements. Because we know it can also result as a barrier, but in some ways it does bring people together when it comes to organizing. So how do these barriers to like essential, necessary resources influence our class solidarity movements?
I mean, I guess I like defining class solidarity, because I saw someone put a comment slash question earlier about
About the
uh
New Deal and welfare.
no, it was from Brenda. It said how can we fight against classism if we still consider us versus them? Um and I think this what you're saying is part of that. So like when we talk about class solidarity, it is a us versus them. Us being, it depends on which part of the line you fall under, and it's about your relationship to the means of production, right? And if you don't have means of production, what Leone mentioned before, then you have to sell your labor to someone who does own it, and those are the capitalists, right? We live under a system of capitalism. The capitalists own the means of production, and then therefore buy us temporarily 8 hours a day, 12 hours a day, however much time they need to then make more money, right? To use our labor to make money. Um, so when we talk about class solidarity, I mean, it starts with class consciousness. First, we have to understand that we are a class. I think a big struggle is most people don't know that they are in the working class because they have convoluted the class dynamic. So you can be lower middle class, upper middle class, lower class, right? Like they got all these different things to try to make it seem like we are not the same. We don't have the same positionality in this fight. And so I think we have to first understand, like when I'm saying class solidarity, I'm thinking about working class solidarity, all of us, right? In a battle against the ruling class. That is the antagonism, the class antagonism that overrides every example you just gave. And so those fights for food, clothing, shelter, medicine, education, healthcare, all these basic necessities of life, that is the fight. That's every fight that we are involved in right now. From this classroom to when you go to get your jobs to when you retire to when you have children. We are always fighting about the necessities of life because under capitalism, those things are commodified. And your point, right? When you get power under capitalism, your job and to maintain that power means to screw over the people who don't have the means of production. That is what you're supposed to do. If you don't do it well, they will replace you from somebody else at Harvard Business or Kellogg or one of these other, fine establishments built on slavery. Um, and then, they'll keep the machine going. So I think, our struggles are always rooted in those basic necessities. And then I think that is the opportunity for us to see each other as one class. Because the beauty, I think, to the sister who spoke earlier about, not knowing that she was supposed to not like Mexican workers or that Mexican workers weren't supposed to like her until college. In Chicago, the way they teach us young is through segregation. You never see nobody of a different race until you go to college because we live in neighborhoods that are 99% one thing or another. And then then they flood us with movies and media that show us racist imagery of the other, right? So then your subconscious is like, oh shit, them black folks sure do steal a lot, or them Latinos got whatever the racist notion the media is gonna push, it poisons our children. And there's nothing real for them to counter it with, right? Because they don't see these other children or other people until they're grown. Um, and so I think, the fight for the essentials to live is the fight, right? That is the class antagonism. The ruling class wants to give us enough to allow us to go to work the next day. That's it. They don't care if we're happy. They kind of don't, they prefer we not be happy. Cool, just shut up. And take it. And so, and through those struggles, like I think about um being in New York City in 2012 after Hurricane Sandy hit hit the East Coast, and we were delivering care packages to folks in the projects because you had these massive towers and no power in the most rich city in, like, one of the richest cities in the world. Black, Latin, Asian workers standing in lines. I had never seen anything like this, standing in lines around the block to just get a care package because of capitalism, right? They couldn't go to the grocery store and get food because they didn't have any money. And these are very, very poor workers. And so a lot of them were on link, and the ruling class's solution was, oh, we're going to give them more link so that they can buy these things, but there was no power, so they couldn't use the link card. So they were just starving. So they were just dying for food. Again, you're talking about New York City. I'm not talking about, some place that we imagine as a third world country, right? That they put in our minds like that. And it was through that struggle, like literally going up and down um 18 floors to deliver these packages, elderly folks who could not leave their apartments. Um, alongside, workers of different races that we're like, oh shit, they could have those breakthroughs that they didn't care about those white workers in those towers either. All that privilege that they try to preach in these universities, that is out the window. When you go to West Virginia, you go to Kentucky, you go to Louisiana, you go to all these places outside of our major cities where you see the white working class is getting smashed similar to black and Latin workers. That once we get in those fights together, then we can start to see, yes, the oppression, there's variations, because that's how racism works. They have to treat someone a little bit better than somebody else, otherwise you can't point. But when we start to fight, we can see our unity, we can see our class strength, and then those notions, those racist notions that they've preached to us about each other start to wither away. They don't go away completely, but they start to wither away.
I'll just add a little
Wow.
bit to that. I mean, I think that was really well said. So about sort of the antagonism, or how we're going to come together if it's us versus them. And I agree with Chris essentially. And it may be something folks don't accept, but if you do accept the principles of the political economy of capitalism, it's pretty blatant in its statement, right? The goal of capitalism is to maximize profits. It's not to make sure humans are doing okay. So you can decide where you fit on that. But if you look at our educational system, it's very difficult for people to, like Chris was talking about the importance of class consciousness. It's very difficult in the United States because we're taught about sort of good and bad and social change in kind of nebulous terms, right? So, you know, people should have the right to vote. The civil rights laws, black folks could go to schools. And I don't mean to diminish any of that. I'm just saying that it's bereft of class analysis, right? I mean, when did you get that? Some of us got it because of outside forces, luckily, that we had in our lives. But you don't go to class and people say, well, civil rights, Title VII, these protected classes. So, Social Security, and that's why the United States is the greatest country, because we have this and this. But there's never an analysis of, what happened in the Americas, how that was capitalism, and at that time we had not yet taken over, or capitalism at the highest point had not taken over the entire world. So you had superior technology go to the Americas, start to grab up land, and so on. And now we're at a point where there's nowhere else to go, right? So you look at the world, and the capitalists have, there's no part of the world, no gold mine anywhere that hasn't been um, exploited. So now we're turning inward, and it's sort of cannibalistic in its nature. And now it's about squeezing as much as you can, because we can't go take over any more natural resources. There's nothing left, right? So now it's turning inward to figure out how you squeeze this last bit out of any workers anywhere. So the notion of fear of other workers and other races and other immigrant status is paramount, because that's what the ruling class had for decades. Y'all know what it had. Well, some of us are older than others, but it was the Soviet Union, right? So anytime wanted to have a national movement, it was like, hey, let's all be united against the Soviet Union. Well, okay, I guess we'll not demand our rights because we got the book. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, right, it was like, oh my God, we need another boogeyman. So who was that boogeyman? It was immigrants of color in some ways, and that was 9/11, right? Y'all can all decide what really happened on 9/11. Each of y'all can decide what really happened on 9/11. What we know is right out of that, right, the Patriot Act and everything, the far right wing was able to get legislation through they couldn't get for 70 years about the right to go into anyone's house, grab their computer, call them an enemy of the state. I worked on strikes in Iowa where strikes were broken, immigration came, grabbed people and SWAT style stuff, and held some of those worker leaders on military bases. And when some of the family said, I don't care if he's back in Mexico, Guatemala, just tell me where I can find my husband. We don't have to tell you because he's been called an enemy of the state, and we don't have to tell you where he is. So the police powers, and these are things we don't get in school, right? What was ICE? the INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, was under the Department of Justice, right? So for many years, if you were caught in this country, it was like jaywalking. Hey, you shouldn't be here from Mexico. Go on back. See you later. And be back in 2, 3 weeks for the next meeting. But when ICE was formed, INS was destroyed and Homeland Security was invented and for black and brown control. So it made more control centralized so that the policing included immigration, whereas before it was Department of Justice. And so just back to this question of class consciousness, we're kept kind of running and dodging and jumping and hiding so much and fearing these other people, and we never get combined with this lack of class struggle in our high schools, right? So all these amazing rights that we have today, some of the unions today that might not be doing the greatest job, if you go back in their history, the folks that got it started, Chris was talking about West miners, coal miners in West Virginia, right? Heroic fights, bloody killings of white owners against white people. The Peabody coal strike, right? Rockefeller, read up on that. It was, they wanted to test out Gatling guns and see how they work. We think this could work. These are white families that were out there on that plane in Peabody, decades ago, slaughtered. So capital doesn't care who they exploit. And we don't get that in our educational system. To the sister was acting like, asking, how do we kind of get this dynamic? Because, like Chris said, if you accept it, it really is those of us who give our labor and those of us who kind of own things. So I think sometimes what happens is we don't want it to be necessarily a sort of a disrespectful engagement and kind of like, isn't there some way we can cooperate and not sort of fight? And unfortunately, I think the more powerful person in the fight dictates the rules, right? And so we'd love to just be like, hey, we should get all these things, but that doesn't happen. And so I think, unfortunately, those of us who've kind of just accepted that, we just openly fight because the powerful oppressor is saying the only way you're going to get anything is to do that. So I think that's what we have to keep doing.
Wow, I really y'all took me to some places with both of your comments there, and I'm really thankful. I'm thinking about conversations we've been having in this class and with other folks over the last few weeks. We're seeing right now how the conservatives in this country who have so much political power right now are pushing us very hard into like or deeper into fascism. And we're also trying to reckon with the fact that liberalism has been amenable to fascism, as people have been pointing out. Like you were saying about the Soviet Union being a boogeyman, there were people who were willing to fight communism because they were sold the idea that we needed to be imperialist and we needed to be colonial as an alternative to communism because that's how much communism was seen as like the boogeyman and the enemy that had to be fought at all costs. And yeah, the us versus them and the capitalists versus the working class seems to be really at the heart of what we're getting into today. And I'm hoping we can get someone to raise their hand and maybe want to come off mute. I'll call you out if anyone has a question or a comment about this, they really want to share, or if you want to, you can put your question in the chat. If not, I got another great question lined up. Okay, well, if you got that, if it's percolating, sit on it. Uh, um, Write it down if you have to, and I'm gonna hit them with another question right now. So we're gonna talk about structural influence on this issue, and in what ways do you think nationalism has undermined racial unity, and how can our social movements rebuild and strengthen our shared liberation efforts?
Sorry, it's a long one. How has nationalism undermined?
How has nationalism undermined racial unity? And how can our social movements rebuild and strengthen our shared liberation efforts?
Hmm. Um, I think nationalism is a really dangerous ideology. I think we've seen it I mean, I think it's really the ideology of the ruling class, right? Like you can take nationalism as like national solidarity, which is then therefore reinforcing the idea of nation states and borders, which, you know, if you're fighting for liberation, I think you have to fight against borders because that is the essence of the us versus them in terms of who's a who and who's a not and who deserves what and who doesn't deserve anything. And then I think there's nationalism in this form of like racial, kind of like racialized nationalism, like black nationalism. It's not necessarily tied to a country, but this notion that if you're all black people are together, what the sister she said, I'm rooting for everybody black. I forget her name, but you know that notion.
Issa Rae.
Issa Rae, there you go. Like I don't root for everybody that's black. We ain't all on the same team. I don't root for Obama. I'm sorry. Like you can't bomb six, seven countries of for me, working class is my people. You bomb those countries, those are my people that you killed. Just because like your skin tone is similar to mine, that doesn't trump that for me. Um, so so I think nationalism is dangerous in a few ways. One is like it will have us seeking allegiances with people we should understand as our enemy. I think it someone brought up this MAGA stuff, right? It has these poor white folks pretending like this country loves them. When they ain't got health care, they ain't got they you know they live in states with like some of the worst education outcomes, right? Like it's killing them, but they are somehow tied to this craziness. Um, and then I think the third thing is that it will have us create alliances with our enemies. So, you know, like I think about what's happened over the past year in Gaza, right? Like, you know, this genocide has been horrific. And I've seen groups on the so-called left or so-called leftist groups rooting for Iran. Like when Iran launched those drones at Israel, people cheered for that as if Iran is pro working class in any way, shape, or form. Like those, the Iranian government kills workers every day, right? And that's been, I think, a weakness of the movement for a long time. This idea of my enemy's enemy is my friend, which is rooted in nationalism. Um, I think is very, very dangerous and will again lead us into the hands of our enemy every time.
That was a powerful example. Leone?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. I mean, I generally agree with Chris's tenet that it shifts allegiances. So nationalism is very important to the ruling class in every country because, while some of the folks in this country will have us say, looking at Mexico and saying, well, we're the United States, we're better than Mexico. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and the rich elite there do the same thing. Try to rile up folks against the United States. And sometimes I'm glad they do in certain ways, but when it comes from them, it's a game because the elites of this country and the elites of Mexico, is in one example, right? Like I know this from personal context, right? Their kids go to the same private schools in the Northeast of the United States. you know, they all meet up and they're buddies, and they hang out and they go to, when they get break in college, they go to the Switzerland and go on ski trips and stuff. And then they come back and promote, that our nation is better than that nation, so that all in their eyes, all the dumb workers essentially can kind of go, and when we're focused on, like, the Soviet Union was great for capitalists in this country. I mean, just the boogeyman, right? And when it fell apart, it was like, oh my God. And again, I think it was replaced by, at that time, it was essentially, Muslim terrorists, but it was sort of immigrants of color because it's even more nefarious than the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was across the ocean. And these people are here among you. right? And so getting us to fear things, being nationalistic, we're going to go against this nation, that nation, and nationalism always arises um, as the alternative to a class consciousness, right? Hitler's an extreme example of that, right? But I mean, he essentially invented a race, right? I mean, in Germany, it was all white folks, right? There weren't large amounts of people of color like here in the United States. I lived in Austria way back when and spent some time in Germany and learned a lot. And it essentially started with all the people they annihilated first. Wasn't the Jews were the final solution, hence the name, right? The final solution. Early on in the 30s, I visited this torture chamber in Warsaw, Poland, called the Pawiak. That place was for people like me and Chris. The first people Hitler went after were organizers. So he went after people of the worker and peasant farmers, right? Like groups. He went to stop the organized resistance and torture people. And then he started working his way through the list. And it was that nationalism, and he couldn't say, well, whites should be like in Germany today. It's against Turks, for example, because so many Turkish people go to Germany. At that time, you had some gypsies. That was about it for people of color. So again, the Jewish question became racial, right? You can notice those Jews, they have longer nose, they have big ears, right? Like literally inventing that there was these other Germans in Germany, right? Who were just as German as anyone else. So that was nationalism at its extreme. But what we've always experienced in the United States, and I think we're seeing a little more out there examples now. Again, it diverts us from thinking about who the enemy is. So the whole anti-immigrant thing, I thought a friend of mine put it really well at an action a couple of weeks ago. What he was saying is they needed some of the folks that Chris is talking about. I spent time in the rural areas of the United States organizing. There's a ton of extremely poor white people. More white people live in poverty than any other single ethnic group, right? But because they're told that we got to go after immigrants, they're right now they're thinking more about that than thinking about, like Chris said, why do I live in this hellhole and none of my kids have any jobs and they graduate from high school and they do meth labs in these housing complex and these mobile home trailer houses because they have nothing else they can do. So nationalism is extremely important in keeping that elite in power, and it's something that I urge people not to accept.
I just say one quick thing, like yes to everything you said. And it just this whole conversation, all I can hear is Kendrick in my head with "they not like us," and like that's the essence of nationalism. Like we are a thing, and then they not like us. And I swear to you, I swear I remember this, but I'm getting old, so it may not be true. But I swear they played it at like the Republican convention or one of those like MAGA joints. They played that song, and I think it's just like a clear piece because like Leone, you're bringing up this immigration, like all the deportation stuff now, and I'm sure most people in this room have been having some crazy conversations with people that you've known for a long time over this issue, and Black folks, Latino folks, this idea, this MAGA movement is not just white. It is pretty multiracial at this point. And I've heard from friends and, Black, Hispanic saying like, I'm American. I don't give a shit about them. And so it's not like, I think we have to also be like real clear. Like, it ain't just like poor white people as like the fascist enemy that's going to be, marching down our streets. It is our neighbors in Inglewood. It is our neighbors in Little Village. It is our neighbors in Humboldt Park that are also saying this stuff. And that's how dangerous nationalism can be. Because um, I remember going to the community meetings at the schools when they were talking about the shelters and hearing some of these Black folks say just horrendous things about these migrants from Venezuela. It felt like I got transported back to the 50s when like Black folks were trying to move into white neighborhoods. It was like they took every word that those racist folks said back then and just like spit it back out. So, I think nationalism is a cancer in the movement for liberation, um, because the only people not like us that we should deem like that are the capitalists. Every other worker is us, and we have to win them, right? To see that point of view as well.
Hey, Caesar, I gotta piggyback
Hmm.
perfectly off that because so in our organization and so when we were urging um, Mexican people, Mexican American, Mexican folks some years ago in those temp agencies to put worker interests above, what you see as us versus these black folks, we made some inroads, but there were Mexican folks who'd be like, I don't care. These guys say they'll do it for 15 an hour. I'll do it for 12 an hour. And we'd be like, no, you never undercut other workers. Come together. You deserve a job. So let's together figure out what the wage should be. Don't undercut people. But some people out of desperation, but they nevertheless went ahead. Some of those same people, like literally same folks I knew from back then, what happened when the Venezuelans came, to Chris's point, right? So, I mean, I know a lot of Mexican folks that are very anti-Venezuelan. So it's not just about, the race. They're like, hey, man, I'm pissed off because I'm down at, 47th and Ashland at the Home Depot trying to jump in the back of the truck, get me a day's work. And these Venezuelans are over here talking about, I'll forget $10. I'll do it for 8. And I'm like, no, no, no. And so the same, look how it came back to bite us because, and I'm not judging people, but just to look at the reality, we didn't make that stand when some of us Mexican Americans were pleading, do not undercut black folks. Don't undercut anyone, but don't undercut black workers. And look now, so much hatred and anger because Venezuelans, in the mind of some of the Mexican workers, were undercutting us, right? And look how it comes around. So the answer is not to undercut and find other people to undercut. The answer is to come together as workers. Never undercut another worker. Just don't do it, and it will come back to help you. But those are difficult lessons, but those are the right lessons we got to learn. And obviously, it's completely antithetical to nationalism.
Wow, that took us all around the world. I was thinking about what you said when you mentioned how um, the different strata, the different ways that tools that people have used to divide us. Like you were talking about, like Romani people, same thing has been said of Bedouin people when it comes to, you know, uh, Southwest Asia and stuff like people who move around or who maybe don't adhere to capitalist property laws. This is the same story of original people of Turtle Island right here, right? The big thing was to pull them into the system, to pull them into these little individual ways in which we like to operate, separate people by whatever it is, whether it's skin color or way of life. And ultimately, we know our strengths are actually when we work together. And so I'm gonna try to get us a couple more questions in before we get to the end here. We had some good ones in the chat that actually I missed earlier. One is about willingness to break the law. This person says they were talking with their partner about how it's necessary, but so many people are unwilling to do it because of the state of fragility that we all live in, which, as we've been speaking about, is mostly due to the capitalist system. So either they have kids to care for, elderly parents. Again, this our individualism. We don't have the big networks, sometimes a big family or village like community that we used to have to do a lot of this work. So we're all kind of taking care of things by ourselves, right? We have jobs that we're worried about losing. We have rent due every month. So their question ultimately is, how can we get people to take these risks? How can we give people the capacity to take these risks?
We have to get people into organizations, right? I think your point around capitalism has gotten us far more isolated than I think, humans, at least in this country. I think other countries are much better at being more collective. Working people in other countries are much better at being more collective. But here we have fallen into, this isolation. I'm gonna get mine, or I'm gonna just worry about me. Like the bosses have really pushed this individualism real heavy here. It's even gotten into, how therapy is done. I was listening to a podcast about a month ago. It was talking about how there's more people in the United States who are disconnected from their family than like any time in human history. Because they were saying a lot of these therapists are now telling people, if someone makes you uncomfortable, the solution is to cut them off, right? And remove them from your space. You need to be at peace, right? I'm going to protect my peace and all that. And so we don't struggle with each other, right? We're not trying to work out differences. We're not trying to move past whatever our problems are. And I'm not saying you can do that with everyone. My point is that it is reinforcing the isolation, which then makes it very, very hard to then get into a liberation movement. If you feel like you are doing this by yourself, you're not going to do it. You can't do it. No individual can beat this system. It is going to take millions of us relying on each other in very intimate ways, childcare, rent, and that, may not be rent, but like I need to know if I'm about to get kicked out of my house, 30 people are about to show up to make sure the police can't do it, right? That is the network we have to build, but you have to be an organization to do that, right? It can't be this hodgepodge. I'm on this Slack channel or I'm in this little text thread, right? You have to be in a thing that is working towards. You talked about fugitivity. I appreciate the explanation because I wasn't quite sure what you meant. But when you said it's like we're trying to fight, we're going to someplace, you have to be in a group that is fighting for something, not just responding to the crises that capitalism creates, right? You can't just be in a healthcare group or in a housing group or in an education group trying to maintain, whatever liberties we currently have, right? I feel like we're constantly on the defensive. We're trying not to lose as much as opposed to being in an organization that's trying to win, right? What does liberation, are you in a group that is organizing for liberation, or are you in a group that is trying to maintain, a reform, a piece of a decent life in capitalism? And so I think that is critical for people to feel comfortable getting arrested. Uh, the times that I've been arrested organizing and felt comfortable with it, it was because I knew I was with a group that was going to have my back. And it's not that the group can have complete control, right? The system can do really horrible things to folks, right? All of us know of the people I'm sure most of us look up to who probably spent a lot of time in jail at some point in their lives, right? It's not nice. But they felt comfortable doing it because it's what's needed to be done. And then two, they were part of collectives, they were part of organizations that they felt they could rely on. So I think we have to get in groups that are fighting for actual liberation, not, holding on to the little bit that we got. And then B, being open to struggle with other people. And then on the flip side, being open to be struggled with, because none of us are perfect. And so, we have to have those relationships where we struggle with each other to push each other to do things that we, may not necessarily be comfortable with. I'm sure, Leone, you can tell stories going into battle. Shit, it is scary. I've done a lot of things that I'm like, fuck. And sometimes I was saying fuck before we were even going to the thing because I was like, this might not go well. But I was with people I trusted and I cared about, and I knew who cared about me. And so we were able to get over that collective fear together. And I think right now we're in a moment of collective fear around fascism. And so the way we're going to get out of it is we get around people who can push us.
Super well said. Trying to think of something to add. I mean, yeah, my opening thing was going to be, Chris, exactly that. Just, it's going to have to be done together. Working Family Solidarity, our organization, we're trying to be one of those groups. But it it really is something we're not going to do alone. I mean, I'm looking at some of the questions that kind of go with that question, which is how do we get, in a way, it's sort of how do we help get people to fight who have nothing, in a way. And I can just say that in my experience from organizing in other states, rural, urban, other countries as well, I think I've probably been I've probably lost more fights than I've won, just if you would look at the totality of the thousands of fights I've been in. But what I tell people is I tend to pick big ass fights. So if I lose, I lose, but I'm not going into some dinky thing, right? Like if we're going to do a strike, let's do the strike. And we all get run out, we all get run out. In some ways, on the one hand, I could look at how fearful. I can think of many instances when I dealt with people either looking at a strike or even just talk, forget talking, looking the supervisor in the eyes for the first time in their life. Not joking. Like for the first time in their life, looking the supervisor and going, "Hey, what's up? I'm here at work today." Just that is like, who you looking at? You looking at me? You don't look at me, mother. I'm not lying, like really. And on the one hand, I can think of people who trembled, like literally were terrified, but I can also think of so many times when people stood up and fought. So, on the one hand, sometimes people won't fight. On the other hand, it's unbelievable when I really think of some of the fights I've been in where people stood up and fought, um, because they felt that even though all of the risks they were taking, they understood the degree of disrespect and just humility and piggishness they were suffering. They could not take it any longer. But kind of like Chris said, in my experience with workers, they don't want a lot of fancy stuff. They want to know, is there a plan? And am I going to be alone? And if you can answer some of those questions, and sometimes I've seen workers do amazing things when they knew they would not be alone, and that was about the only guarantee they had. They were probably going to get fired. They were probably going to have all these other problems. Maybe they get evicted. But if the organization was there and whatever happened, we were going to make a fight out of it. We were going to go down swinging. It really is amazing how many times people have responded and fought. So I think we can't underestimate all of our own ability to take on really, really hard fights.
I really appreciate y'all. We want to start wrapping up really soon, and we want to have a little space for our kind of wind down. But I want to throw one more question at y'all. I know both of you all are family people with kids, and maybe you can help people with this question, which is how how do you bring a family up? How do you bring your children up in solidarity with other people when they are constantly being faced with hearing the opposite, how they should be the exact opposite of solidarity? Like you said, how they should be out getting theirs, trying to get paper, trying to do that thing, that individual be the king that America preaches to us.
Okay, well, I'll say something, but yes, I have an 11-year-old who thinks she's 15, and I have a 7-year-old who's about to be 8, and they've grown up with and their mom, my wife. I mean, she came to this country as an undocumented person. She came in the smuggled in San Isidro, south of San Diego, right? That border crossing in the back trunk of a car a long time ago. Um, so over time, she's been able to, adjust her status. But so the kids have grown up. I mean, like right now, my little guy's about 10 feet over here, and my little girl came in, and usually she wants me to like let her sit on my lap and kind of listen to y'all. Um, they couldn't come Saturday, Caesar, because my wife was sick, so my kids just stayed home with her. But they came the previous Saturday, and in general, when I tell them I have to go to something, they want to come. They were at that reparations march, um, and as we were walking along, Claudita, so she was 10 at the time, now she's 11, but we were walking along, showing solidarity. And our thing was to try to bring the two communities together. We'll march for reparations if we're allowed to say we want reparations and work permits. So we can talk a little bit about Black people, a little bit about Latinx workers. And so she was getting into the chants. I had the bullhorn for a while in my section. And when I stopped to take a break, she was like, "Dad, don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." she was all into it, and this was not her first time, right? So and then so I'm like, okay, honey, let me take a break. And then as we're walking, at one point, and these are, and I know Chris enough to know that because we've talked about this, so that he can totally relate. But um, one of the proudest moments of my life, for sure, as a father, Claudita kind of looked over to me and goes, "Dad," as we're walking, she goes, "You're raising us the right way." And she literally said that. I mean, I could have cried. I was like, "You're gonna have to carry on." I believe in being honest, right? We ain't gonna fix this by the time I'm not here anymore, and hopefully I'll leave before you do. But y'all will have to take this up because those contradictions don't go away. That you just got to keep fighting them. And so I think one thing that's very important is honesty. Just talk to the kids. Kids can understand a lot of stuff. And I think by them being around stuff, you're not just talking, you're just letting them be in that environment, and then they can figure out a lot of stuff. So those are some of the things. Just keep them going with you when you're doing your activism. Just let them be part of your life.
Wow, Chris, what you got? That was pretty hard to follow, but your kids was in the room on Saturday when I saw you, so I know what you about to come with.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think me and Leone were raised similarly and are trying to raise our kids in a similar fashion of like around a lot of people, around a lot of different people. Like, I think that's critical. I was raised, again, in a very anti-nationalist, a very international. I think that the opposite of nationalism is internationalism. And that's the type of household I was raised in, that the international working class were my people. And so I always adapted, or not adapted, I accepted everyone else's culture as my own, whether or not that was being played, that music was being played in my house or not. That the culture of resistance, no matter whose resistance it was mine, and that I should embrace that. And I try to teach my kids that. I just got on this whole salsa kick now. Some of y'all are gonna be way ahead of me, but I didn't know like salsa music is like hella pro black. And so, I just been like learning. And I'm like, now I gotta learn how to dance. Like I gotta get it together here.
Chris
Um,
put me on Saturday,
oh,
for real. It was bumping in there.
got a playlist. Again, talk to y'all want the playlist? I'll send y'all the playlist.
Hell
Um,
yeah, we want the playlist.
But so, it's like I try to raise my girls with that. So I have three daughters, 7, 10, and 19. And my oldest is at one thing I always tell them when they go to school, your job is to learn as much as you can so you can help everyone around you. Because I think education, particularly in this country, is all about you. You're gonna be smart, right? You're gotta be creme de la creme and all that BS. And again, I want them to have a sense of uh they're in service even at 5 and 6. Their job, their purpose is to be in service of others. And that that's what makes us good people, is how we try to help other people. Not the accolades we can get for ourselves. That's just self-serving. And that's actually what the bosses want. Look how special you are. We're gonna put you in this little nice class, and then don't worry about them because they didn't deserve it, right? They didn't deserve the extra book. They didn't deserve that field trip to the opera, or all the things that they do to try to stratify. So yeah, I think and then bring them to all the shit. Like they got to see the stuff. Not all of it. Like you can't go to the violent joints till later, and allow them to make up their own mind. So I think, dissimilar to folks who I knew who grew up in the church, it was like that was what you were gonna do. You were gonna be in the church. Um, my parents were always like, you have to make this decision at some point in your life, whether or not this is the identity that you're going to take on. And I try to do that for my girls, that I'm going to teach them everything I know, but they're going to have to decide if this is the path they want to walk.
Damn. I don't know. I couldn't have asked for a better last question, and those responses gave me a lot of life, for real. I just want to say thank you to both of you all, and thank you to everyone who came. And I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Tiffany Ford, who's going to close us out and give you all some information on how you can keep keep it going and tell you about next week. And again, just thank you everyone for coming through. We appreciate y'all. And solidarity forever.